July 7, 1968, 2:17 a.m. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. The humid night air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried chicken. A man clutches his chest. He falls. The King of Harlem, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, is dead. Hollywood wants you to believe his driver was right there, catching him, inheriting the crown in a tearful goodbye. That's the movie. That's the lie. The truth is colder. The truth is Frank Lucas wasn't the heir apparent. He was a ghost, a shadow. But while the other hustlers were fighting over crumbs, Frank was looking at a map of Southeast Asia. Within 3 years of that night, Frank Lucas wouldn't just be running Harlem. He would be running an empire that generated over $1 million a day in revenue. We're talking about 98% pure heroin, blue magic. A product so potent, so deadly, and so cheap, it didn't just break the market. It shattered the laws of economics. The Italian Mafia, the Five Families, the French Connection, they were playing checkers. Frank was playing three-dimensional chess with live ammunition. He built a pipeline that stretched from the poppy fields of the Golden Triangle directly to a 16th Street. No middlemen, no markups, no mercy. But what the world didn't know was that Frank had a plan nobody saw coming. To understand the flood, you have to understand the drought. For decades, Harlem was a colony, a plantation. The landlords were the Italian Mafia, specifically the Genovese family. They controlled the numbers racket, they controlled the unions, and most importantly, they controlled the dope. If you were black and you wanted to sell heroin in Harlem, you bought it from the Italians. You paid their price. You stepped on their product, diluting it with quinine, sugar, whatever you had, until it was a weak, brownish powder that barely got a junkie high. You kicked up a percentage of your earnings to a fat man in a social club in Little Italy. That was the law. That was the ceiling. Bumpy Johnson navigated this world with a switchblade in one hand and a chess piece in the other. He was a diplomat. He kept the peace. He kept the Italians from swallowing Harlem whole. And in the passenger seat of Bumpy's Lincoln Continental sat Frank Lucas. Frank was a country boy from North Carolina. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. He didn't wear the pimp suits. He wore a suit and tie like a businessman. He drove, he watched, he listened. Most guys in the life, they talk too much. They want the credit, they want the fame. Frank wanted the knowledge. He studied Bumpy like a scholar studies a rare text. He learned how to collect a debt without throwing a punch. He learned how to bribe a cop without saying a word. He learned that the loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. He absorbed. But he also saw Bumpy's frustration. Bumpy was a king, but he was a king in a cage. The Italians set the boundaries. Bumpy hated the heroin trade. He hated what it did to his people. He called it poison, but he was a pragmatist. If the poison was going to flow, he would be the one to regulate the tap. He made Frank swear on it. You control the street. You don't let the street control you. You keep the violence down. You keep the product away from the kids. You maintain order. Bumpy was old school. He believed in a code. Frank saw the code as a shackle. When Bumpy's heart stopped beating on the floor of Wells' restaurant, the leash snapped. The Italians thought they could just install a new puppet. They thought it would be business as usual. They looked at Frank Lucas and saw a driver, a nobody. A hillbilly with a heavy foot. They didn't see the predator waiting in the tall grass. They didn't know that the driver had been memorizing the route to the bank. If you're already hooked on how Frank Lucas outsmarted the most dangerous men in New York, hit that subscribe button right now. We are peeling back the layers of a legend that Hollywood got wrong. What happens next didn't just change the drug trade. It changed history forever. The vacuum left by Bumpy Johnson was violent. Street crews were warring for corners. The Italians were squeezing harder, raising prices on their diluted product. The supply was trash. The demand was skyrocketing. And thousands of miles away, a war was raging in Vietnam. Most Americans saw Vietnam as a tragedy. Frank Lucas saw it as a supply chain. This was the escalation. The moment the driver took the wheel, Frank realized that buying from the mob was a sucker's game. Why buy from the retailer when you can buy from the factory? He looked at the soldiers coming home. Hooked. Desperate. He looked at the news reports, the Golden Triangle, Laos, Thailand, Burma, the source. But this was also the moral test, the line in the sand. Bumpy Johnson had always preached that you protect the community from the worst of the vice. You don't flood the streets, you regulate. "The silent man lives, the loud man dies," Bumpy would say. But Bumpy also said, "Don't sell death to your own." Heroin was a necessary evil to Bumpy, a way to keep the Italians from totally running the show. To Frank, it was just a commodity. Frank faced a choice. He could fight the other crews for scraps, playing by the old rules, kicking up to the mafia and selling garbage. That was the safe money. That was the easy money. Or he could do the unthinkable. He could cut the head off the snake. He could bypass the mafia entirely. It required a level of ambition that bordered on insanity. He needed to go to a war zone. He needed to negotiate with warlords who didn't speak English. He needed to figure out how to transport tons of product halfway across the world, through U.S. customs and into the heart of Harlem. And he had to do it without the five families finding out. Because if they did, they wouldn't just kill him. They would erase him. Frank looked at the no heroin rule, the unspoken agreement Bumpy had to limit the damage, and he torched it. He didn't just want to sell drugs. He wanted to change the chemical composition of the street. He wanted a monopoly. He chose power over principle. He chose the flood. He recruited his family. Not street guys, not loose-lipped hustlers. His blood, the country boys. Brothers and cousins from North Carolina who knew how to keep their mouths shut and their heads down. Loyalty wasn't bought, it was bred. Here's the move that separates the criminals from the masterminds. The genius wasn't in the violence, it was in the logistics. Frank flew to Bangkok. He ventured into the deep jungle, meeting with a warlord named Kun Sa. He bought kilos of raw heroin for $4,200 a unit. In New York, the mafia was selling that same unit for $50,000. Do the math. The margins weren't just good, they were astronomical. But the real magic trick was the transport. This is where the legend meets the grim reality, the cadaver connection. The story goes that Frank smuggled the dope in the coffins of dead American soldiers. Hollywood loves that image. It's poetic, it's dark. Frank claimed he put it in the false bottoms of the coffins. Others say it was in the furniture, the hollowed-out cavities of teak desks and heavy cabinets shipped back by service members. The method matters less than the result. The result was a pipeline of ghost inventory. The U.S. military was unknowingly Frank Lucas's shipping department. While the DEA and the FBI were tearing apart suitcases at JFK, Frank's product was landing at military bases, marked as government property, or the remains of heroes. It was invisible. Then came the product itself, blue magic. In the 1970s, street heroin in New York was maybe 10% pure, if you were lucky. It was mostly milk sugar and quinine. Frank's product hit the streets at 98% purity. It was white, it was powdery, it was lethal. He didn't step on it. He didn't cut it. He branded it, Blue Magic. He put it in blue glassine bags. This was the tactical checkmate. Frank could sell a product that was 10 times stronger than the competition for a lower price and still make more profit than the Italians because he owned the entire supply chain. He was the farmer, the wholesaler, the distributor, and the retailer. He was the Henry Ford of heroin. The feds were baffled. The streets were flooded with high-grade dope, and nobody knew where it was coming from. There were no wiretaps picking up conversations with the mob. There were no informants in Little Italy whispering about a shipment. The dope just appeared like magic. Frank set up processing mills in the Bronx and Harlem. Naked women, so they couldn't steal product, wearing surgical masks, mixing the dope in a cloud of white dust. Money-counting machines ran 24 hours a day. The cash smelled like chemicals. They had to use duffel bags to move the paper. They bought real estate. They bought laundromats. They bought dry cleaners. Not to make money, but to wash it. Frank was 10 steps ahead because he realized the drug game wasn't about being a gangster. It was about being a CEO. The streets of Harlem were buzzing. Blue Magic was the only thing that mattered. The lines wrapped around the block. But silence has an expiration date. The Italians started to notice their pockets getting lighter. The Gambinos, the Genovese, the Latisis, they were losing millions. Their junkies were going to Frank. Their dealers were going to Frank. The confrontation was inevitable. It wasn't a shootout in the street. It was a sit-down, a dark room, thick cigar smoke, the heavy hitters of the Italian mob on one side, Frank Lucas on the other. Historically, this is where the black gangster bows down. He apologizes, he pays a tax, he kisses the ring. Frank walked in with a different energy. He didn't carry a gun, he carried the leverage of the market. Imagine the scene. A capo, face like granite, leans forward. "You're breaking the rules, Frank. You're making too much noise. You're eating off our plate." Frank doesn't blink. He speaks softly. "I ain't eating off your plate. I bought the restaurant." He laid it out for them. He could sell them his product 98% pure for a fraction of what they were paying their own French suppliers. He offered to be their wholesaler. He flipped the script. He wasn't their employee, he was their supplier. The room went quiet. The tension was thick enough to choke on. These were men who killed for sport, but they were also businessmen. They looked at the numbers. They looked at the purity. They realized that killing Frank Lucas would stop the flow of the best product they had ever seen. Greed overrode pride. They didn't kill him. They bought from him. It was the ultimate victory. The driver had forced the owners to pay the toll. Frank walked out of that room untouchable. He had united the most dangerous elements of the underworld under the banner of blue magic. He was the king of New York, but Bumpy's ghost was always there. The warning echoed. The loud man dies. Frank had won the war for the streets, but he was starting to lose the war with himself. The money was too big. The ego was swelling. He was no longer the shadow. He was becoming the sun, and if you fly too close to the sun, you burn. The downfall didn't come from a snitch in the camp. It didn't come from a rival crew. It came from a coat. A chinchilla coat. March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Alley versus Frazier. Everybody who was anybody was there. Sinatra, Kennedy, and Frank Lucas. Frank walked in wearing a $50,000 floor-length chinchilla coat with a matching hat. He sat ringside. Better seats than the Italian bosses, better seats than the vice president. He was broadcasting his power to the world. He broke his own rule. He broke Bumpy's rule. He got loud. Detectives from the Special Investigations Unit saw the coat. They saw the hat. They saw the man. And they started digging. A task force was formed. Richie Roberts, a prosecutor who was as obsessive as Frank was disciplined, got the scent. The investigation took years, but the chinchilla coat was the first domino. The raid, when it finally came in 1975, was a military operation. They found more than $500,000 in cash in his house in Teaneck, New Jersey. They found the keys to offshore accounts. They found the evidence of an empire that had rotted the core of the city. Frank Lucas was sentenced to 70 years. He turned state's evidence, ratting out the corrupt cops and the mob connections he had fostered, reducing his sentence, but destroying his reputation on the street. The legacy of Frank Lucas is a double-edged sword. He proved that a black man could dominate the global drug trade, bypassing the traditional gatekeepers. He was a genius of logistics, a master of branding, and a cold-blooded capitalist. But the cost was a generation of addiction. He flooded Harlem with a tidal wave of misery, wrapped in blue glassine bags. He ignored the one thing Bumpy tried to teach him. You can govern the dark, but you cannot become it. Frank became the darkness. He didn't just break the rules, he created new ones, and for 7 years he lived like a god.